Hey Bookaholics, and welcome back to another reading vlog. For today's reading vlog, we are going to be going through a vlog that I am hoping will take me the majority of the month. So this is my background vlog alongside my other vlogs, and this one is I am going to be participating in Jane Austen, which is created by my friend Elise over on Pr9de on Instagram, and she is actually carrying this out over on Ben and Grace's Discord, which I will leave linked down below. It is, as it says on the tin, to read through all of Jane Austen's works. Now, Jane Austen, for those of you who don't know, is my favourite author of all time. The adaptations of her works are literally how I get through my mental health crisis. These are very important books to me. I am going to be reading them in the order in which they were written, as opposed to the order in which they were published, meaning this is the order I will be following. And I'm going to quickly go through all of these books, and the way that this vlog is going to be structured is literally I'm going to read a book and then afterwards chat to you about it. So however long it takes me to read the book, because there are so many, I'll just do a check-in with each book. So let's start. The first one that we're going to be reading is Northanger Abbey, and this one is the first book that she wrote, and it is Gothic satire, so it is satirizing the Gothic genre. In this story we are following Catherine Morland, who is to go and stay in Bath with some family friends who would like her to experience more high society, and there she begins to draw attention from two families. We have the Thorpe family, who are a wealthy family who seem very kind and very welcoming, and then we have the Thorpe family, who are a social climbing family, for want of a better word. And it is how she navigates this, and she goes and stays in Northanger Abbey, which she then lets her imagination get carried away with her and allows herself to believe that more goings on happened there than actually did, and so on and so forth. I am very, very excited to give this one a reread. It's been a while since I've reread this one, and I will also, I think after each of these books, also talk about some of the adaptations that I have watched and my thoughts on them. The next one up is one of my absolute all-time favorites, and this is Sense and Sensibility, and this one is the story of two sisters. We have Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, who come from an affluent family, but having had no brothers upon the demise of their father, they are then cast down in society, and they are then left to have less money and less prestige, and it is the love between the sisters, and it is also their romantic lives as we follow them as they are thrust into society. Eleanor is arguably one of my absolute favorite characters I think I've ever read, so I am very excited to give this one a reread for the gazillionth time. The next one that we have is the most iconic, the most famous one, and that is Pr9de Prejudice. This is following Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters as her mother seeks to find them husbands, and when a wealthy gentleman moves into the neighborhood and brings with him his proud and arrogant and unlikable friend, it is how Lizzie and her sisters' love lives fare during this time period. And then the next one that we have is Mansfield Park. This one is Jane Austen's love letter to the abolitionist movement, and in it we are following Fanny Price, who comes from a poor family but has wealthy relations who she goes to live with. She is treated very poorly by the majority of these relations, however she does have very strong feelings for the one cousin of hers that is kind to her, and it is how her life and her dynamics are upheaved when a brother and sister move in to the neighborhood and begin to attract the attention of the family. This is probably the one that I respect the most and enjoy the least, obviously because it has themes of abolitionism in it. I'm always appreciative of that in the story, but it's the one where I swoon the least over the romance, so do with that what you will. Another one of my absolute favourite Jane Austen novels is Emma. Emma is the story of Emma Woodhouse, who is a wealthy socialite who is in a position where she's never going to need to marry, so instead she tries to fancy herself a matchmaker and believes that she is doing good by trying to marry off all of the other women in her life. She begins to believe in her matchmaking abilities to the point where they become erroneous, to say the least. I love the romance in here. I love the romantic lead in here. He is one of my absolute favourite male romance leads, so very excited to read him again. The next one that I have is Persuasion, which is her most mature and the book that was written entirely in her life, the last book that she wrote, but was published posthumously. And this is the story of Anne Elliot. It's a second chance romance, as Anne was engaged to Captain Wentworth when they were younger, and she was persuaded to end the engagement as he was not of wealth or rank. And then he returns into her life 7 years later, and then it is how she still has feelings for him, and it's the change of circumstances that they both find themselves in, as her father now is in debt and he has made his fortune. Again, her most mature work by far, so a very exciting one to read. And then the last one that I have here is the bind up of her 2 unfinished novels and her epistolary novella. So the epistolary novella is Lady Susan, which is told entirely in letters, and it is basically the story of a woman, Lady Susan, who is trying to marry off her daughter so that she can secure her own position in life now that she is a widow. We also have in here the Watsons, in which we're following Emma Watson, who is due to receive a large inheritance. However, when she is stripped of said inheritance, she then has to decide whether or not she wants to marry for love or marry for economic means and stability. And the last one we have is Sanditon, which again, an unfinished novel. And in this story, we are following, oh god, what's her name? It's been a while. Charlotte Haywood, how her and her family are in this place called Sanditon. It is actually very focused on this coastal town, which I have very vague memories of. It's the story I think I've reread the least because it's unfinished, so it was kind of depresses me a little bit, but I am happy to jump in on this occasion. So with that being said, this is the pile of possibilities for throughout the month. As I said, I will just check in as and when I have read a book, and I will talk about the book and possibly about a couple of its adaptations. And I will be starting with Northanger Abbey. So I'm checking in because I have in fact finished Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. So obviously I will give my thoughts on the book, and then I'll also talk about the adaptation that I have watched as well. I've read all of these books before, so my thoughts are potentially going to be a bit more like, hey, I still love this. Northanger Abbey is, to me, the most different, the most distinct of Jane Austen's works. It's where you can tell that she still was figuring out her style, and not in a bad way, and also not as a criticism of the other works. This is just the one that has a very different atmosphere and style to it. The writing style in terms of the satire, the type of prose, the humor, all incredibly present. That's not what I mean. In this book, we have our protagonist's imagination getting away from her, and it's shown on page, and I feel like we are much more inside the character's head in Northanger Abbey than we are in any of the other works, where it is a lot more, we get to see what their thoughts are and what they are pondering. We get to witness them. But in this one, we get to see further past their immediate thought process and more of their psyche, further deep into their brain. So it's a fascinating story to read of hers. I do really like the way that we have the characters laid out in here. Now, like you would expect with any books of this time, there are a lot of conversations around gender norms. It is obviously very binary, but also within that, it is very men are from Mars or men are from Venus. You have a lot of discussion around, so for example, our character started out as quite a tomboy and then became more feminine, the way that that's a good thing. So obviously that is portrayed in here, but owing to the time period, I'm not only willing to excuse it, I think it's actually it was an important conversation starter at the time. All of her books are to criticize conformity, which includes criticizing the way that gender appearance was so important. So while it probably wouldn't fly today, where it's like, girls have to be a certain way, they literally did back then if they didn't want to get completely shunned by society. But to me, Jane Austen Austen, whenever she brings something up, bearing in mind she needed to be able to get published, so she couldn't do anything incredibly radical. So to me, whenever I read Jane Austen bothering to put that representation in her books at all, it was for the sake of representation for girls who were more tomboyish, and equally importantly, so that she could very subtly poke at social conventions. And I do think that that's important. So taking into consideration the time period, I think that it is incredibly well handled. But obviously, if you are trying to appeal to a modern audience, it is going to fall short when it comes to discussing things like gender. Obviously, all of her books are also heteronormative, etc. Random tangent aside, I had a great time with this one. I do really love the way that Jane Austen describes, especially Northanger Abbey in this, because obviously we're getting it embellished for a purpose. The whole point is that we have Catherine's mind exaggerating her surroundings, and it works. I did really appreciate it, and I did really enjoy it. I'm going to give all of these 5 stars. This is going to be a 5-star vlog because it's Jane Austen. I'm basically just kind of highlighting the things that stand out to me in this book. Likewise, in the adaptation that I've seen, this is a very difficult movie to create an adaptation of, I think, because you get so much of the side tangents inside Catherine's brain. The one that I watched is the 2007 adaptation. In it, we have Felicity Jones as our protagonist, Catherine Morland. It is also one of the first films I had seen Carey Mulligan in, who I absolutely love. We have some really interesting portrayals of the story in here. The things that it doesn't have time to keep in, I think that they chose wisely what they did and didn't decide to keep in. There are definitely some things in there that I think other directors would have probably chopped that I'm glad that they kept in. So there was a lot going on there that I really enjoyed. I really liked the depictions of Bath. The cinematography was really nice. It's not a Jane Austen adaptation that I love enough to rewatch frequently like some of the others that we will talk about as this vlog goes on, but I really did appreciate the acting. I really did appreciate the direction. Now, the love interest for me is probably the weakest point, both in the book and in the movie. The actor who plays the love interest, J.J. Fields, did a really good job of portraying it accurately. He's just not a love interest that does it for me in the slightest. I don't really buy into the relationship as much as I think I should. It feels more rushed as a romance for me than a lot of the other works where her writing has become more polished. And that does sadly reflect in the film as well. I didn't really feel like they were ardently in love with each other like you get with a lot of other Austen stories. Fantastic satirization of Gothic literature, fantastic commentary, great humor, weaker on the romance. I don't read this book for the romance. I read this book specifically for Catherine. I am reading it because I want to follow Catherine, not because I am interested in her romance. However, the romance is just a byproduct of the plot for me, hence why I can still happily give it 5 stars. Hey vlog, checking in because I have in fact finished Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This one is probably one of my favorites. It definitely has my favorite Jane Austen heroine in it, which is Eleanor Dashwood. In this story, we are following 2 sisters who are Marianne and Eleanor, who have gone from being part of quite a wealthy and prominent family, now that their father has died, are going to be a lot poorer because the estate has to pass from father to son. So it passes to their half brother, who technically has no obligation to them because he's not a full brother. Now they have to go live in a little cottage in the middle of nowhere, and we are following their love lives as well as their interactions with each other and society. I really appreciate this book because the idea behind most Jane Austen's books is to satirize the society that she's in. In this case, it is satirizing how both sisters approach to society is somewhat condemned, and at the same time neither is doing anything wrong. We have Eleanor, who is very sensible, who is very practical. She is the one who is mostly navigating this transition in their life, how to go from one to another. She's the one that keeps up with how much they're spending to make sure they don't go over budget, make sure they can afford things, etc. While on the other hand, we have Marianne, who is very sentimental, very emotional. She's the one that is, for example, helping their mother navigate her emotions during this time while she's lost her husband and her home. The way that the two are necessary to society. We're following their love lives as one of them is in love with Mr. Edward Ferrars, who is the brother of their sister-in-law. And they meet him for the first time as they're about to be removed from their home. And their sister-in-law doesn't like them. So she doesn't want Edward to be interested in Eleanor because Eleanor has no money. And then we also have where we have Marianne, who has two suitors. One is Colonel Brandon, who is a older suitor, and he is still very handsome, and he has a lot of interest in the same interests as Marianne when it comes to music and poetry. And then on the other hand, we have Willoughby. Now, Willoughby is a young man. He has his own estate. He's about to inherit another. He's also quite wealthy. He's a lot more exciting, and he is a lot more outgoing, and he elicits her into showing all of this feeling, into embracing dancing with just him in a ball where that's not proper, and riding around in a curricle at full speed and doing things that aren't necessarily proper but that are exciting. And it's how they go about these romances. I really love the way that both Marianne and Eleanor are written. I think that they're really well written because they are flawed people, but they are people who are, nowadays you just think of as two people who are quite different, but back then there was one that was doing it right and one that was doing it wrong. And the whole idea is to satirize the fact that the society is what is wrong and not the girls. So I really love this book. I love the sisterly focus that is mostly focused on the sisters, but obviously it is a romance, so the love lives are there. The biggest downside to me for this book personally is Edward. Edward is the love interest of Eleanor, and we see him basically at the beginning and then for a couple of scenes, because at the beginning we already know that Eleanor is in love with Edward, so we don't actually need much more development on that for the narrative. But obviously we don't get to spend a lot of time with Edward. I would have liked to have got more Edward, although I understand why we don't. It means that then I don't connect with Edward the same way as I do a lot of the other love interests. My second favorite Austen love interest is in here, which is Colonel Brandon. I think that he's just so well written as a love interest, and I think for me, having my favorite heroine in here and one of my favorite love interests in here, and they're not actually a couple, is quite hilarious, because yeah, I'm not fussed about Edward at all. Not that he doesn't suit Eleanor. I think temperamentally they're great together, and we see a lot more of Eleanor than we do Marianne in the beginning, and then we kind of see more of Marianne's love life unfolding after they leave their original home. So the balance is there. I just wish that I cared more about Edward. Love this book. Again, one of my favorites. And all of the side characters, we have the Middletons and Mrs. Jennings, obviously their mother and their sister Meg. We also have characters that I think are just so easy to loathe. You have Fanny Dashwood. You really want to throttle John Dashwood. You've got Lucy Steele, who you hate, but her sister Anne is fabulous and hilarious. I thought that it was so well written, and I love this one. As for adaptations, the two adaptations that I watch quite frequently of this novel is the 1995 movie with Emma Thompson playing Eleanor, and Marianne is played by Kate Winslet. We also have Hugh Grant playing Edward Ferrars. We have Greg Wise playing Willoughby, and we have Alan Rickman playing Colonel Brandon. This was an interesting one for me because it's a beautiful film, but it's less accurate than the other adaptation I'm going to talk about. It's beautifully shot. The sentiment is wonderful. The actors, as you can tell by that star-studded lineup, is impeccable. I think that Hugh Grant is probably the best rendition of Edward Ferrars that I have seen, and Greg Wise is irrefutably the best rendition of Willoughby that I have seen. I would say that I have more of a disconnect with Alan Rickman as Colonel Brandon, but that's mostly a writing and narrative choice than it is an acting one. First of all, I think that, again, this is slightly less of an accurate retelling because you need to be able to tell the whole story in 2 hours. So there are things that are dropped. There are characters that are completely removed in their entirety, and it doesn't really affect the overall story. But it does mean that then some of the characters change slightly. So, for example, for me, Alan Rickman doesn't do the best as Colonel Brandon because the way this story is told, it feels like Colonel Brandon is a consolation prize as opposed to someone that Marianne could learn to love for who he is. You don't really see the evolution that you see in the book of Marianne, going from thinking of him as someone who was quite serious and could be quite boring as someone who is just as romantic as she is. He just doesn't show it in this exaggerated, over the top way. It's all in what he does instead of what he's saying. I don't feel like that is portrayed. It's more just like he's done nice things for me and therefore I should settle for him, is what I got from the film. I think Kate Winslet does a great job as Marianne, although a little bit more spiteful, I think, than book Marianne, in my opinion. Emma Thompson brings everything that you should bring to Eleanor, but she is a lot older. Emma Thompson's 35 in this role and Eleanor Dashwood is 19 in the book. So the narrative changes from everyone thinking, even when Marianne seems to be acting improperly and therefore may not get many suitors, that there's still hope for Eleanor, who is doing everything properly. While in the film, you have it where everyone's worried that Marianne will end up a spinster like Eleanor because she's played by a much older actress. Also, the age gap between the two, as I'm fairly certain that Kate Winslet is maybe 21 when she's playing Marianne. The age gap between the sisters also makes their closeness a little bit less realistic. So then you do have them where it's just like they are sisters, but they don't have the same level of closeness. They don't have the midnight chats that they have in the book. They don't have the we're cold, let's get into the bed together voluntarily. It's just, oh, well, we share a room, so we have to share a bed. Those kinds of things. It's just little things that just create a little bit more distance between the sisters. I will get into why Greg Wise is the best Willoughby when I talk about the other adaptation, because that's more important. But I also think that I like Hugh Grant more as Edward. He's less accurate as Edward than the other adaptation, but he's more fun, and therefore he's more what I wanted from Edward, while the other one is what we actually got from Edward in the book. So it's more accurate, but Hugh Grant actually brings him to life in a way that I found more entertaining. Lots to love. Like, again, fantastically acted. It's beautifully shot, and it still manages to tell the story in its entirety. So it's not affecting the story, it's just affecting some of the characters. But that's fine. It's the first adaptation of a Jane Austen that I ever saw, and I absolutely love it. A great film, not as good of an adaptation. With the 2008 adaptation that we have for Sensibility, it is a BBC miniseries that's in 3 parts. And in this one, we have Hattie Moran playing Eleanor Dashwood. We have Charity Wakefield as Marianne. We have Dominic Cooper as Willoughby. We have Dan Stevens as Edward Ferrars, and we have David Morrissey as Colonel Brandon. In this adaptation, the best Colonel Brandon and the best Eleanor, in my opinion, a more faithful Marianne, and then we have a worse Willoughby and a more accurate but less engaging Edward. In this one, we have much more closely paired actresses. The actresses look close in age, and while they don't look like a modern day 16 and 19-year-old, they do look younger. So having them actually be young women who genuinely would be out in society, and none of them are spinsters, it also means we don't need to throw Eleanor under the bus and have it where she's the one that has lost her bloom, and it's more that Marianne has ruined her reputation for being so outgoing, so over the top with her emotions and her affections. So we don't need to throw Eleanor under the bus, which I did feel like happened a little bit more in the movie, because obviously Eleanor is someone who is more just needing to be practical because she's not got much going for her, while in this it is just a personality trait thing instead, which I really did appreciate. I think also having all of the sisters younger meant that then the little sister made sense, because in the film, again, where you've got Emma Thompson who is in her 30s and then she has a sister who is in her tweens, it just doesn't make sense. So like having all these sisters like 10 years apart just doesn't make any sense. Well, in this one, you know, you've got a 12-year-old, you've got a 16-year-old, and you've got a 19-year-old. Like, they are closer in age. As for the love interests, we have a much better rendition, I think, of Colonel Brandon. You see him being consistent and loving and gentle and showing interest in Marianne, but you see the way that him and Marianne interact with each other before Willoughby comes on the scene. You see them develop a friendship, things to talk about. They like talking about books. He takes interest in her music. So then eventually it comes down to the fact that when Marianne needs to realize what's going on, eventually comes round to Colonel Brandon, because she sees all of his good qualities as things that she has always wanted, but that just weren't exciting enough to her to begin with. And then realizing that the consistency that he has had all these years. On the flip side of that, we have a much, much worse rendition of Willoughby. My least favorite element of this entire adaptation is Willoughby, and not because of the actor, because I know that Dominic Cooper can be a fantastic actor. I love him in The Duchess, which has Keira Knightley in it. Love him in that, so he can act this part perfectly. But we are, for narrative choices that I completely disagree with, told from the start of Willoughby's villainy, which is a shame, because throughout the book and throughout the film, you are brought into liking Willoughby. You disagree with him sometimes with the way he talks about other people, or how flamboyant, over the top he can be, and you know, the damage that can do to Marianne's reputation, but you don't ever feel like he's a villain. You just feel like he's careless. With this one, the very opening scene is showing you Willoughby's villainy, which means that then we have no reason to connect with Willoughby, to fall in love with Willoughby, which means we don't share in Marianne's heartache, which just kind of ruins that whole element of the story for me. So a substantially worse Willoughby for the choices that were made. You know, the way that they clearly instructed Dominic Cooper to act was to show that he was not a good guy from the start. You're not supposed to fall in love with him, which stop telling me how to feel about characters and just let the characters develop on their own. It really frustrated me, and that's the only element of this adaptation that I dislike. Edward is much more accurately portrayed. He's a lot more emo boy. He's a lot more frustrated than in the movie adaptation, and I think Dan Stevens does a really good job of portraying pretty much everything that we see of Edward on page really well. I just don't really care about book Edward that much, so I think that the Hugh Grant one was more entertaining, but the Dan Stevens one is substantially more accurate. So do with that what you will. So yeah, fantastic adaptations, both of them. I love them both dearly, but they both have their flaws. So it depends on what you are wanting out of an adaptation. I really like miniseries because they're longer and they are able to fit more in. If you'd rather a movie, then the film is beautiful, so I would also recommend. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, alongside two of the adaptations. Hey vlog, I'm checking in because I have now finished Pride and Prejudice, which, as I said in the intro, is the most popular of Jane Austen's works. It's the most well known. It's the one that has countless adaptations and reimaginings. I did do a spinner wheel vlog a while back, I think in April, where I read a load of the retellings of this book, so I'll leave that linked in case you want to check out my thoughts on some of the adaptations and retellings. But we're going to talk about the book. I love this book for so many reasons. The main reason that I love this book is actually how humanizing it is for the time period. In this story, we are following Lizzie, who is part of a family of landed gentry, but her mother does not have the best backgrounds, and her father doesn't really take an active interest in the prospects of his daughters, which means that they have very little to recommend them apart from their very, very well-renowned beauty. So when a young man of good fortune moves into the neighborhood, their mother decides to thrust all of her daughters upon him on the hopes that he will marry one of them. We then follow the love lives mostly of Lizzie, but also of her older sister Jane, and eventually also her youngest sister Lydia. I really appreciate this novel because, as I said, it makes the past feel more human. We see this messy family that feel like a very real family that you could know even today, that just live down the road. You know, you have an overbearing mother, you have a somewhat disconnected father, and the relationships between all of these family members. We then also have the trials of love here. We have is often referred to as a opposites attract. It's kind of not. It's that they are very similar, but they fail to see it. While in the book, I think that it's portrayed as them having much more differences to begin with than in some of the adaptations. I think it does a really good job of showing that society is a lot of the time what was getting in the way of people finding happiness and finding matches a lot more than people's actual base nature. I think that for me, within this book, there are a couple of characters that upon my gajillionth reread of it, I would have loved to have seen a bit more of. We have Mary and Kitty, who are the other two sisters that we don't see as much of. I think that Charlotte Lucas is an interesting character that we potentially could have explored more of and could have been a heroine in her own right in a different story. I think that Caroline Bingley is a fascinating character and one who is, I suppose, again, satirizing women of this society in an interesting way and provides an interesting conversation around the ruthlessness that was necessary in the marriage prospects area at this time, because you needed to marry and how different women would go about it. Some would want love, some would want practicality. So you'd have Lizzie, who wants to love her spouse. You have Charlotte, who just wants the protection, security that would come with the spouse. And then you have Caroline Bingley, who wants to socially climb with her marriage. All of these things being different things that were ingrained into women and the criticisms that Jane Austen provides for it, which was fascinating. I think that for me personally, I understand why this is the most popular one, because it has such fantastic flow and pacing. It's really captivating. As I said, it feels very human in its depictions of the characters and their interpersonal relationships. And it's so funny. It's really funny. No one talks about how funny this book is. It's hilarious. So I would highly recommend you check it out if you are a bit intimidated or scared of it. It's fun. It's a rom-com. Honestly, it's a rom-com. This is why we have Bridget Jones, just so you know. As to adaptations, I'm going to be talking about the two most common ones, and then also a new favorite of mine that I have talked about recently that I would just like to mention for anyone who's looking for some Jane Austen recommendations for adaptations. So the most common, most popular adaptations are the 1995 BBC miniseries. That is a 6-part series and it features Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy, and we have Jennifer Eel as Lizzie Bennet. I think that this is probably one of my favourite Jane Austen adaptations. Is probably one of the most faithful. Now, there are a couple of things with this one that I will point out. One is that the way that especially Mrs. Bennet, but overall some of the characters act, is more suited to the 90s when it came out than the adaptation of the book that they are talking about. Back then, it was very easy to be seemingly improper. So you could quietly whisper to someone that you would like your daughters to have an advantageous marriage. You didn't need to shout it across the room. You could very easily giggle too much with one man or dance too many times with one man to be improper. You didn't need to talk about you run off your feet and loudly shout and scream across the room. I think that there is a middle ground. I think that the whole idea is that these characters are exaggerated. I just think they're exaggerated to the extreme. That being said, other than that, an incredibly faithful adaptation. It's definitely got the better Wickham in it, George Wickham being a character who is eventually discovered to be villainous. And again, just like I was talking about Sense and Sensibility before, I like that the 90s versions deceive you along with the characters. You really like these men. You buy into their stories, you buy into their affections, and then it hurts when it's revealed that they are not. Unlike with the later adaptations where it's hand-holding and showing you from the get-go, don't trust this man, which, I don't know, I want to go on the journey with these characters. I don't want to know before they know. I think that the 1995 5 adaptation also did a really good job of portraying the extremes that you have of Darcy and Lizzie more, and that is literally because it has more time. You have Lizzie being someone with a quick temper. She is someone who very quickly comes to judge people, assumes the worst in people a lot of the time. And then you have Darcy, who is someone who's very prejudiced, who assumes that everyone is after his money, who is really tired of being thrown people's daughters at him. He looks down on other members of society, and it shows those extremes a lot more. And that's something that I really appreciate, because then you get more time to watch them come around, and the conversations they have with each other make them realize their standpoints and eventually come to a middle ground. And I really like that, which obviously the film doesn't have the time for, so it needs to start with a mellower perception of these characters. So I really like that we get the extreme versions of Lizzie and Darcy that we have from the book in the adaptation. The other adaptation, of course, is the 2005 film with Keira Knightley as Lizzie Bennet and Matthew Macfadyen as Darcy. Again, we start out with milder versions of these characters. Lizzie's temper is nowhere near as severe as it is in the book or in the 1995 adaptation, and Darcy's prejudice and rudeness are nowhere near as extreme as they are in the other adaptation either. In Darcy's case, it's more that he's portrayed as someone who is shy, that comes off as cold and aloof, and in Lizzie's case, she's someone who is just protective of her loved ones as opposed to someone who is quick to temper. I understand why we watered down those aspects of these characters, because we don't have enough time to watch them go from A to C, but they need to go from B to C. And I understand and I get it. Beautifully shot film. Acting is superb. Again, the two downsides to this for me, the only two things that I would say I have a criticism of in this film. So while in the other one, my criticism was the slightly exaggerated acting that we had a couple of times there. In this one, it's the opposite. It's that we're not showing enough, especially in two characters. The first one being Mr. Bennet, who is played by the wonderful late Donald Sutherland, who I think is a fantastic actor, but completely wrong for this character. This character is supposed to be witty and sarcastic and humorous, and Donald Sutherland is just kind of like subdued and quiet. We definitely don't get a true version of Mr. Bennet with him. Do not for a second imagine it's from poor acting. It's more from writing choices, but it's not an accurate portrayal at all of Mr. Bennet. And the other one, as I said, is with Wickham, who in this one is showed to be someone that you don't necessarily warm to or care about, someone who is a lot more distant and one that doesn't really make much of an effort to win you as a viewer over. And he lacks all of the charisma that you get with Wickham, because the whole idea is that Wickham, it literally says he has such happy manners, he is bound to make friends, he is someone who comes across as fun and delightful to be around, and the movie Wickham just doesn't do that at all. And again, no criticism to Rupert Friend either. He's also a great actor, just the writing for this character clearly wasn't there. So yeah, fantastic adaptations. Some criticisms because I think they're necessary, but wonderful adaptations. Both of them are beautifully shot. They're very, very different styles. I think that they both do a really good job of conveying the story within the parameters of what they are able to. The one thing that I will say, I don't normally like modern iterations of Pride and Prejudice because they normally miss the point for me when it comes to the social divide. The one exception that I can make, the one modern day adaptation I've watched so far that I would highly recommend you check out if you are wanting a modern Pride and Prejudice retelling, is Pr9de Prejudice, which is a Bollywood film, and there it does talk about social inequity in a way that is befitting of Jane Austen. I just thought I'd slide that in there because I want more people to watch this film because it was a fantastic Pride and Prejudice adaptation. So now I am moving on to the next book, and I will check back in once I have read it. Vlog, I have finished Mansfield Park, so it's time for me to check in. I'm doing so many from the bed check-ins. I am ever so sorry. I finish a book and then I update, and I do a lot of reading in bed. So here we are. We have Mansfield Park, and this one is character-wise probably my least favourite. Thematically, one of my favourites. Jane Austen wrote this book because she was in a time period where she was a woman, so she didn't have very much say, and she couldn't just write papers on abolitionism because at this time she was writing anonymously, and she couldn't just write on abolitionism. Like, who would listen to a woman during that time period? They were barely listening to men that were nobility. So instead, she wove it very intricately into her romances. For anyone who has ever said that romances are insubstantial, in this time period, women were basically relegated to reading novels. This was a proper read for a young lady. So Jane Austen used that power of reaching young women with the notion of abolitionism. In this story, we are following Fanny Price, who comes from a very poor family and goes to live with some wealthy relatives. And while she is with these wealthy relatives, who don't treat her very well apart from one of her cousins, Edmund, she eventually grows up and is always just very compliant, very helpful. She's always there for the family, while the family's children are actually all rather spoiled. She's very kind, very diligent. She's very sweet with the a lady of the house who tends to have a lot of ailments, and we are following her as she is falling in love with her cousin Edmund, and then eventually how this sibling duo, Henry and Mary Crawford, move into the area, begin to draw interest on Edmund and Fanny respectively. While we're following Fanny, we are also in the background seeing that the wealth of her uncle is at risk because he is a plantation owner in Antigua. And we see things like older cousin who goes with her uncle over to go and try and quash the rebellion. We see how he is traumatized by what he sees. We see how abolitionism is affecting plantation owners. We see the morality of it. But most importantly, when it comes to the conversation in this story, we see how someone who is kind and loving towards Fanny is still not a good person for owning slaves. And that's the thing. That's the message that Jane Austen was trying to convey with this story. I am sure of it. It's that just because to you, he is your kind uncle, he's your generous neighbor, he is your brother-in-law, does not mean that what he is doing is moral. And she showed that through the kindness of Sir Thomas and the trauma of her cousin. And that was her abolitionism statement, woven into a romance so that it would still get published and still get read and would get into the hands of young women. And I deeply admire that. We also have a huge conversation around class divides, and just because someone is poorer than you does not mean that they deserve less respect. In this case, by highlighting Fanny's good nature versus that of the spoiled Beltram daughters. So I really did appreciate this story for what the messages it was trying to convey. I don't really connect with Fanny on any kind of emotional level. I don't really care very much about Fanny, I'm not going to lie. And I don't actually like Edmund as a romantic lead. Edmund from this and Henry Tilney from Northanger Abbey are my least favourite love interests. They are probably on a par. Maybe Edmund a little bit less than Henry. Henry, it's just that I don't connect with him emotionally. Edmund, there are parts where I actively dislike him, especially because it's just like he eventually comes to realise that Fanny's a nice person and that she's always been there and consistently cared about him. Why did it take me so long to realise, kind of thing? But I don't really like him as a love interest. In most Jane Austen novels, you get a villainous love interest as well. In this case, it's Henry Crawford. I think Henry Crawford was portrayed in a really good way because this is the first time I think that we've seen one of Jane Austen's villainous romantic leads. And you as the reader know he's a villainous romantic lead. And so does the protagonist. Fanny does not fall for Henry Crawford. And you as the reader also do not fall for Henry Crawford. And that was fascinating because normally you have it where there's these handsome, flirtatious guys that you're falling for and the characters are falling for, and then it's revealed. While with this, it's more that she knows and you know, and no one will listen to her, and everyone's trying to encourage her to marry him, even force her to marry him, and she doesn't want to. It's the exact opposite of what Jane Austen normally does, and that was fantastic. We also have where Mary Crawford is this really overly ambitious socialite, and it shows as well. She's the opposite of what we normally see with the likes of Lucy Steele in Sense and Sensibility, or the opposite of what we see of Caroline Bingley. She is someone who is pretending to be nice so that she can get in with this family. It's the exact opposite. She's not someone who is being a bitch and it's thinly veiled. She is someone who is trying to be really lovely and really sweet and really friendly, but it's all just out of ambition and not genuine. I really appreciated that, because it is Jane Austen learning how to twist her own tropes. So I love that as well. Fantastic book. Probably wouldn't arguably be a 5-star under other circumstances, but the conversations both around class and also abolitionism are so important to me, were a huge turning point for me when it comes to understanding messages that authors put in their novels. When I first read this, that I always feel really strongly about it, because it was the first time that I truly understood the depth of themes that Jane Austen weaves into her books. So I still hold it very, very dear, and therefore it still gets its 5 stars. I've watched 2 adaptations of Mansfield Park. The first one is from 1999 with Frances O'Connor playing the role of Fanny Price, and one of my all-time favourites, Johnny Lee Miller, playing Edmund. Now, this one for me is a very faithful adaptation. It actually leans a lot more into the slave trade than you get in either the book or in the other movie. I think it actually is having that conversation right in the forefront of the story in a way that I deeply admire about this film. This is my favorite adaptation because, again, my main draw to Mansfield Park is the conversations around the themes that Jane Austen is bringing forth. So then this movie highlighting those, and those being the core components, and the romance just being there to bolster up the story while the themes are really prevalent, I thought was really important, and I really, really appreciated. I think Frances O'Connor does a really good job of being Fanny as well, someone who does have a lot of personality but that actively subdues it on the basis that she needs to fit into this family that she's grateful to. I also think that the way that the interpersonal relationships between the other cousins, so not Edmund, the other cousins and Fanny, and the way that that metamorphosizes was also done really well, especially her relationship with her oldest cousin. And then her romantic relationship with Edmund I definitely bought into, even more than in the book actually, because the kind of closeness that they have is that you can tell that they're in love with each other, and that it's just taking Edmund a hot minute to figure it out, and it's only because of how exciting Mary Crawford is. It's almost like as if Edmund were Marianne and Fanny's Colonel Brandon and Mary Crawford is Willoughby. It's just that Mary's more exciting at the moment, but he even has his apprehensions deep down, and you can tell, and I really loved that. Elizabeth Davids is stunning. I love her. So her being Mary Crawford worked so well as well. She's got this alluring charisma to her, while at the same time you can still see the undertones that maybe she's not as sweet and gentle as she seems, because you're seeing it from Fanny's perspective, so you can tell that the Crawfords are not good, but at the same time Fanny's befriended Mary, and Mary is nice to Fanny, and there aren't many people that are nice to Fanny. So it's a great conversation to be having, and I really do appreciate this adaptation, and it's my favorite of the 2. The other adaptation is the 2007 adaptation that has Billie Piper as Fanny Price. It has Blake Ritson as Edmund, and also equally importantly and noteworthy, because my bisexual soul needs to mention it, is we also have Hayley Atwell as Mary Crawford. So obviously I think that this is arguably my less favorite of the 2. Like, a lot of the time it's like I like these things from this one, these things from this one. Most of the time that's the case. In this one, my favorite is the 1999 one. This one's a decent adaptation. I don't dislike it. I enjoy it. I still watch it. I've rewatched it. It's not my favorite. There is a decisive winner this time. With this one, I think that Billie Piper leaned more into the Cinderella story. This story is much more of the Cinderella aspect of Fanny than it is the themes of Jane Austen. Like I said, the 1999 one was a lot about the themes and all of the conversations Jane Austen was clearly trying to have with her book. This one is the Cinderella romance. You've got this poor girl who is brought up by this rich family and falls in love, and everything else takes a backseat. And it's about the trials and tribulations. Now, I think that Billie Piper does a really good job of playing the poor, helpless, underprivileged Fanny really well. I just don't think that we see a huge amount of the Fanny that Edmund sees. So when we're reading the book, you see the way that Fanny changes when she's around Edmund. She's allowed to be herself. She's allowed to have a little bit more attitude, be a bit more funny, talk more freely, which you don't see. You don't really see at all in this adaptation, which means that I don't really buy into the relationship between Edmund and Fanny aside from her pining for him. I don't actually think that he's in love with her at all until maybe the end, and it's just more of a comfort thing. It's kind of, again, like we were talking about with the Colonel Brandon, Willoughby and Marianne thing. If Edmund's Marianne, this is like the 1995 adaptation where he settles for Fanny because she's been nice and she's not going to mess him up after being hurt by Mary. Now, don't get me wrong, I also would be hurt by Mary. I would allow Mary to hurt me because it's Hayley Atwell and she is gorgeous and she is stunning and she is fabulous as Mary. I think that it's done in a way that I really appreciate the way we see the relationship between Fanny and Mary as well. How torn Fanny feels because Mary is nice to her, but she knows she's wrong for Edmund, and also she knows that this woman is driving a wedge between her and Edmund because she wants to marry Edmund. So many things going on here. I really do enjoy this story. I think that it was a good film. I just don't think that it focused on the things that I want in an adaptation. Those are my thoughts on Mansfield Park, including its adaptations, and we'll move on to the next one, and hopefully I will be back to chat to you about that soon. Hey vlog, checking in again because I have in fact finished Emma, which again, one of my favorites because it is one of the times where we are following a more imperfect protagonist. And I'm not saying they're imperfect in the sense of like Lizzie has a temper or Marianne is quite willful or any of those things. A character who them in themselves is a social criticism. So normally the social criticisms that Jane Austen brings forth within her stories is to discuss the way that society impacts women. This one is discussing the way that privileged people wield their privilege. In this case, we have Emma, who is repeatedly interfering with Harriet Smith's life, her entire life and her future prospects in a time period where this woman would have had next to none. And we are following it as Emma repeatedly interferes for her own amusement with very little regard for the actual outcome that this might have on Harriet's well-being and future. It is the discussion around the way that some privileged people, including women who, though their privilege was still less than that of a man's, still very much wielded a lot more privilege than others around them, the way that then they were blinded to the plights of other people and the way that they perceived watching people get married and their lives and their livelihoods as a form of amusement and entertainment as opposed to something that is going to be life altering. I really liked this story. Knightley is actually my favorite romantic lead of Jane Austen's because I absolutely love a man who is honest, and the thing is that he is never too brutal with his honesty. He needs to be brutal because of how Emma is as a person, but he is honest in a way that is just candid. It's not sugar-coated, but at the same time, it's not the level of rudeness that you get from Darcy because it comes from equal standing. And you can see this in the way that he treats different people. He is honest with Jane, he is honest with Miss Taylor, and he is honest with Emma, and he takes it in accordance with their position and the level of privilege or not that he has over these different women. He respects them, but he also respects his own position of privilege. And that is an important topic. It shows the importance of men wielding their privilege with understanding that even if it is not something they asked for, the level of privilege that they have is noteworthy. So I really do love that about this story, and I would highly recommend you check out this book if it is up your alley, to read about matchmaking and a little bit of like a Mean Girls-y vibe to it. And there's a lot of women who are a bit disconnected from the world, and not necessarily in a bad way. I don't actually ever think badly of Emma. I don't think that she's a bad person. And that's a level of nuance that I think Austen does really well, is that a lot of the time she doesn't create characters that are completely villainous. She just creates people who make wrong choices in this story. While we have had very villainous women in the past, like Caroline Bingley, for example, or to an extent Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Fanny Dashwood, Emma isn't doing this with malice. She's not one of those women who is trying to ruin someone else's life. She genuinely thinks she's improving people's lives. She just doesn't understand the social consequences of what she's doing because she's so far removed from anyone else's reality. Another character that I think is really noteworthy in here that is also a flip on what is normally a villainous character is we have Frank Churchill. Frank Churchill behaves in exactly the same way as both Wickham and Willoughby. He is someone who is deceitful in his attentions towards a woman. In this particular case, it is not considered that he is a villain solely because of the impact it has on Emma. Emma is neither in need of a husband for security's sake, and therefore her reputation cannot be tarnished. Likewise, she is not in love with Frank Churchill, meaning that when he pretends to be in love with her solely for the purpose of disguising his affections with Jane, it is not done in a way that makes you think quite as badly. And that is the thing. It's the discussions around intent and abuse. And I think that the way that she reintroduces this character archetype in here specifically, where we as readers are driven to dislike Mr. Elton more than Frank Churchill, is very important, because we dislike Mr. Elton because of his treatment of Harriet, who had hopes and expectations on this man, who had a lot riding on this man. While with Emma being mistreated by Frank Churchill, it does not impact her life, while it does impact Harriet. So all of her books are a conversation around the way that men's impact on women can be defining in their lives, and whether or not it makes a man a villain or not depends not on his actions alone, but on the impact it has on the woman in question. I very much do enjoy a lot of the conversations that are had in here. I could go on, but I loved it. I have 4 adaptations of Emma that I have watched that I would talk about because they're all noteworthy in different ways. Of the 4 I'm going to talk about, there is again a decisive favorite. With a lot of the adaptations, there are a few that I enjoy for different reasons. With this one, I have one favorite, and the others I have quite a few issues with. There is only one adaptation of Emma that I actually enjoy watching frequently. All of the others are just, I have watched them and then varying degrees of like to dislike. The first one I'm going to talk about is, there are 2 from 1996. The first one is a film which features Gwyneth Paltrow as Emma and the wonderful Jeremy Northam as Knightley. I think he does a fantastic job as Knightley. I do not rate Gwyneth Paltrow's acting. I think that she is not very good at being Emma. I think that she brings forth the poutiness of Emma really well, and therefore is very good at creating this unlikable character that you get in Emma. I never soften to her, and therefore I don't ever feel like I am happy for her in the end, and I don't fully understand why Mr. Knightley would ever be in love with Emma, because there are very few redeeming qualities in the way that she is presented in this story. As much as I love Toni Collett, and you will not normally find me ever criticizing this woman because she is one of the best actors on the face of this earth, she is terribly miscast as Harriet Smith. The whole idea is that she is very pretty and looks the part. She just isn't very educated and doesn't come from noble birth, but she is quiet and she is sweet and she is kind and she is pretty, and that is just not how she's presented. And it's not that Toni Collett can't be pretty, not in the slightest, but the way that she is presented in this, it's very much more for a comedic side character than anything else. So I don't think that she was the right fit for it either, thus meaning that the only character that I found truly well cast is Jeremy Northam. We also have Ewan McGregor as Frank Churchill, and while I do think that he is much more equipped to be someone that you love, I don't think that the slow transition that we get within the story of we like Frank Churchill to we actually find him a bit of a man-child, because throughout the story you need Emma to not be in love with him on her own terms. You need to witness her like him a lot and then realize, actually, but I could never marry you. At no point do I see enough of a change in the way Frank Churchill is presented for this to happen to Emma. The next adaptation that we have is another one that I also have issues with, and that is another 1996 one, is the ITV movie with the wonderful, gorgeous Kate Beckinsale as Emma. And then we also have, not normally leading man material, but does a wonderful job, Mark Strong as Mr. Knightley. And I think Mark Strong does a good job of being Mr. Knightley, but again, Mr. Knightley is someone who is supposed to be quite stern and quite serious, but you are supposed to fall in love with him. He's supposed to have these redeeming qualities. And while I think that for Mark Strong, he is a much gentler character than you would expect from Mark Strong, he definitely doesn't present with enough gentility to warrant being a faithful adaptation of Mr. Knightley, in my opinion. So he is a very good actor and does a really good job. He's just not my Mr. Knightley. He's just not one that I buy into. I love Kate Beckinsale with my whole heart, but she is terrible at being Emma. There is not a single redeeming quality in her either. I find that she is actually less fun as well. Gwyneth Paltrow does a good job of being fun. A few of the other adaptations do a good job of being a fun version of Emma, because she is supposed to be like high society, someone you want at a party, someone you want to have fun with. And I just didn't get that at all from Kate Beckinsale. She's just moody and pouty and really annoying and a spoiled brat, and that's all there is to her. I never see any lightness. The whole idea is that Emma is a bit oblivious because she is not ever in a position of turmoil. You know, it starts out with there would be very little to distress or vex her for many years to come, and that is exactly the thing. She does not seem someone who has never been distressed or vexed. A lot of them seem like she is bored, and yes, she can be manipulative and she can be a bit of a brat, but she's never short of being able to say nice things, say the right things, be a lot of fun. She's fantastic at socializing, and I just don't get that from Kate Beckinsale's Emma at all. Also find that Mr. Frank Churchill in this one, I can't remember the actor's name, he also is a little bit too standoffish. Like, again, he's supposed to be like Emma. Everyone thinks they're really compatible because, again, he's outgoing and fun, and it's all a facade, but he's outgoing and he's fun and he's enjoyable to be around. And then you're supposed to over time see his true colors and see him actually maybe be a bit more of a dipshit than we initially thought. And I just don't get that with him. I never found the levity or the lightness in him. So it's like this adaptation took all of the light and fun and entertaining and vapidness almost that you could get from high society. All of that has been removed, and everyone's a lot more moody and stern, and it didn't work for me as an adaptation. It's a good film, but it's not a very good adaptation. The next one, chronologically, is my absolute favorite. That is the 2009 BBC miniseries. We have Romola Garai as Emma. She does an amazing job. She is my favorite Emma to date. I love her. We have my one true Jane Austen adaptation, love of my life. We have Johnny Lee Miller as Mr. Knightley, who is my favorite rendition of Mr. Knightley. A wonderful ensemble cast going on here. I think everyone did a fantastic job. Michael Gambon is a wonderful Mr. Woodhouse. He does a great job of being Mr. Woodhouse, and I think that for me, it's my favorite adaptation because everyone feels very human. It's not designed to make you hate Emma. It is designed to make you be annoyed at Emma. The same way as Mr. Knightley sees her, where it's like, you are such a lovely person, you're such a good person, and you keep making all these stupid mistakes just because you're bored and it's ruining other people's lives. Why are you like this? That's how you feel about her. She's not supposed to be likable, but you are also not supposed to hate her. And I think that Romola Garai does such a wonderful job with that. The way that this was written and the angles it chooses to take on so many of the characters. We see a much more flawed version of Frank Churchill, thus allowing us to equally fall in love with him at the beginning and fall out of love with him right alongside Emma. The best rendition of Jane Fairfax we have ever had. I love the actress that plays Jane Fairfax in this. She is fantastic. Overall, I just think that this was the best ensemble cast. I love Johnny Lee Miller as Mr. Knightley because he does provide this level of gentility towards those who deserve it and level of harshness towards those that eventually prove to either not be as decent as they seem, like Frank Churchill, or Emma, who he really desperately just wants to actually stop making these ridiculous mistakes. So overall, fantastic adaptation. Love it. To me, it's perfect. If you want a perfect adaptation of a book, of a Jane Austen book, the only one I can think of that I would say outright right, I just think that this is a perfect adaptation, is the 2009 BBC miniseries of Emma. Perfect adaptation in my eyes. And then the last one is one that sadly I expected I would absolutely adore, and I don't. I don't like it. It's not even that I don't adore it, I don't like it. And that is the 2020 Emma. I know everyone loves it. I know. Love Bill Nighy. I should love it. I should love this. This should be my jam. Okay, this is the worst lately. I can't even remember the actor's name. He is miles away from being even close to a decent Knightley. I cannot stand him. He is rude and he is boorish, and the thing is, he doesn't show any ounce of gentility to anyone else. I can't stand him as Knightley. It just doesn't work for me. Frank Churchill is already presented as someone not trustworthy way too early on. I think Anya Taylor-Joy's version of Emma is where we are definitely pitching Emma as a villain, because it's like she is actively trying to get her own way regardless of other people, while in all of the other adaptations, it definitely feels like Emma is trying to get her own way, but because she genuinely thinks it's the right thing, or at least has convinced herself it's the right thing. In this one, she just doesn't care. She doesn't give a shit if she's ruining other people's lives. She wants things done her way, and that's it, and that's fine. I think that, again, I adore Bill Nighy. Bill Nighy is one of my favorite actors. He is way too active, way too social to be Mr. Woodhouse. Mr. Woodhouse is an elderly gentleman who is a hypochondriac, who is afraid of everything and is afraid that his daughters are going to get sick. He has a parasitic relationship with his doctor. None of those things came across. He's too fun. He's too Bill Nighy. He's too smooth, too suave. And I need someone who's much more of a mess to be Mr. Woodhouse. I do not like this rendition of Jane Fairfax. I detest this version of Harriet Smith. I do not like this version because I feel like it was like the director was trying to make a point with this story. He took this story and was like trying to make some kind of commentary, but the book already had its own commentary and you're talking over it and you're manipulating the angle of the characters to make them seem worse than they are. And I understand creative license and artistic differences, and I understand why people would like this. It's got an interesting shoot style. It's got an interesting approach to the story if you want it changed up. I don't want it changed up, and I don't think that there is a single thing in this that I like, because everything just seemed to be talking over Jane Austen instead of bringing forth her story. So I understand the appeal of it. Unlike with especially the Gwyneth Paltrow one, I don't really understand the appeal. I understand the appeal of the 2021. I just actively dislike it, but because it rubbed me the wrong way. But I understand why other people would like it. So there we have it. Those are my thoughts on Emma and 4 adaptations of it. So yeah, I will move on to my next one. My next one only has 3 adaptations that I've watched, so it'll be a little bit more chill. But yeah, we'll move on to the next one and then I will chat to you about it once I am done. Hey vlog, I am checking in again because I have now finished Persuasion. This is Jane Austen's final work when it comes to actually completing a book within her lifetime, and it was printed posthumously. This is a second chance romance. Everyone has always stated it's her most mature work, and I think that mature in this sense is that we are following people who are slightly older, who have had more experiences with the world than a lot of her previous heroines, who were very young and were still of your typical end of the marrying age. While these protagonists, you have our protagonist herself, Anne, who is in her late 20s. And then we have our main love interest, who is even older. So they are definitely older protagonists. And again, we have a second chance romance. So it's people who have had time to fall in love with each other and then have been separated and had time to grow as people before reuniting. So I do definitely see what people say when this is her most mature work. In this story, we do see two people need to overcome their pasts as well, and the understanding where they each were coming from in their own lives and in their own pasts, and overcoming the resentment that they might feel towards one another. So I think that we see a lot going on here. Anne is an interesting protagonist to follow. She could very easily have been a doormat of a character, someone who doesn't have a huge amount of personality, or who is so meek that that's why she tolerates the way that people treat her. But it's less that, and it's more to do with the fact that she is someone who cares very much about the people around her, and the idea of things being divisive. She's trying to appease everyone, and it normally comes at her own expense. I really appreciated the message that this was, especially I imagine for the women of the time period who would have been put in positions to often set aside their own needs for that of their family, for that of their spouses, for that of their children. They will have seen themselves represented in this heroine, and I think that's really, really important. This one also has conversations around class divides and around especially the way that the upper classes treated the lower classes in regards to money. So you have it where Captain Wentworth was not an eligible man. She should not have married him. And now that he's made his fortune, everyone is living to regret that she didn't take him up. Now that her family have no money but have a title and he has money, the whole idea of we will interfere to separate them when they were happy, but now that it's to our convenience, we're more than happy for them to marry, and then highlighting the hypocrisy of that. Now, Lady Russell's an interesting character to read about within the book and several of the adaptations. She is someone who is just interfering. She is meddling. She claims it's for Anne's benefit, but it is benefit in the sense of because it's a man of good wealth and good fortune and good position, regardless of how Anne actually feels, and takes very little consideration for Anne's preferences. So I don't actually think that she's portrayed as a good character. I don't think she's portrayed as a good person. And some of the adaptations do change that, and they do put her in a more maternal light, that she cautioned for the sake of whether or not someone would be able to provide for her and take care of her, knowing that whoever Anne marries she'll be dependent on for the rest of her life. In the book I didn't get that vibe, so she's an interesting character to follow because I spend most of the book wondering why Anne is listening to this woman at all. So yeah, I enjoyed this book. It's definitely one of her most polished and more refined books when it comes to the actual writing style as well. Now, I do find Wentworth a little tiny bit insufferable at times. There are times where I literally just want to shake him. I think that his kind of pride, interesting because he's similar to Darcy in the sense that he acts very proud and therefore casts judgment on other people. But he himself has been judged. The thing with Darcy is that he's not experienced being judged. And as soon as Lizzie judges him, he's like, whoa, okay, no, I don't like this. Why have I been doing this to other people? Wentworth has been judged, and now he's like, well, now I'm going to judge other people. And that's not the kind of man that I could ever vibe with. And I don't care that afterwards he's like, yeah, I've always loved you. He doesn't really do anything to make up for how he's treated Anne. They were separated when she was 18. She was 19 at the time, and they were separated because he was making her choose between him and her family. And instead of it being a lengthy engagement and him being like, listen, let's just stay engaged, keep it quiet, and then we'll see what happens, he immediately just left, never heard a word from her again, and he was fine being mean to her afterwards. I don't like him. I don't think that throughout the book, Darcy does so much to make up for how he treated Lizzie. I don't feel like Wentworth at any point makes up for how he treated Anne, while Anne has stayed very consistent. And he can clearly see why she was persuaded otherwise. He's just butthurt about it. So I don't like him as a love interest. But I do love this story. And I do love the message of this story. And I like the way that our protagonist is portrayed. So I still enjoy the book. He's just not a love interest that I actually like. But as for how interesting of love interest he is, he definitely outranks the likes of Henry Tilney or Edmund Bertram, because I find him interesting as a love interest. So he's an odd one to place because he's probably the one I least like in terms of romantic sense, but he's definitely quite far up when it comes to how interesting I find him as a love interest. As for some adaptations, I have watched 3 adaptations of this book. Well, watched a few, but the ones that I want to talk about, I have 3 adaptations. The first one is that of the 1995 film that has Amanda Root as Anne Elliot, and we have Kieran Hines as Captain Wentworth. Kieran Hines does a really good job of being Captain Wentworth. I think that he shows the sternness, the meanness, the pride, alongside the gentility and the kindness that you later on get from him. So I do find him a very interesting adaptation of this character, and I think he's handled really, really well. I think that Amanda Root is a little tiny bit too meek for my liking. I would have liked that throughout the story you do get Anne having these quiet moments of strength, which I really appreciate, that I think were kind of watered down a little bit in this film. I think she does a really good job of playing the character. It's more to do with the writing than to do with the acting, but the way that she's presented through the writing is slightly meeker than we get in the book, which I would have preferred to have been amped up a bit. But it's a really well shot film. It's a really good adaptation. I think it sticks to it rather faithfully, and I have no real complaints about it at all. The 2007 adaptation of this is probably my least favourite of the 3, which is very controversial in opinion, and we'll get to that in a moment. My least favourite because it's not as accurate as its predecessor, and it's not as entertaining as its successor. So for me, this one, Sally Hawkins is Anne Elliot, and I think that she does a decent enough job. There is the most awkward kiss scene I have ever watched on screen at the end there, because it's supposed to be romantic, but it looks like she's chomping on something. It's just an awful lot of before they kiss, and I have no idea what is going on, and not in like the sexy Keira Knightley way either, just in like and I don't understand what is happening. I didn't really vibe with her necessarily as Anne. I think that she's got a tiny bit more gumption than Amanda Root's Anne, but I don't think that she really brought as much personality as Amanda Root did, so it kind of swings and roundabouts. I think that it's a decent adaptation. Is probably just the one that I engage with the least. I really buy into the chemistry between the 2 leads. I think that works really well, especially the tension when they are still in their fallen out era. I think that works really well. So it's still a pretty sound adaptation. It's just one that I connect with least. And weirdly enough, the 2022 one where you have Dakota Johnson as Anne, I actually do enjoy this adaptation. Now, it is a terrible adaptation in terms of taking the content of the book and actually just making an adaptation. It is so wildly unfaithful. It has so many cringy moments. It is a terrible adaptation. But by God, is it such a fun film? Like, if you're watching a film just for fun and it's a bit wacky and a bit absurd and you're just taking this story and just changing it up, it's a good time. It's a fun film. I went into this thinking I'd absolutely loathe it because I'd heard such terrible reviews. And if you're wanting an actual adaptation of Persuasion, as I said, this is a terrible adaptation. But it's a fun film. No one talks about how fun this film is. Everyone talks about how amazing Emma is. And Emma is beautifully shot, the 2020 Emma. Beautifully shot. So much elegance in there, fantastically cast. I had no fun with that film. There's no fun in it. If you're going to change up the atmosphere, the vibe, the tone, and the characterization, I would much rather you do what they did with Persuasion, which is just make it a buttload of fun. It's a romance and it's fun and that's it. And I loved that. I did. I genuinely did. And sue me. So is it a good adaptation? No. Is it a fun film that has roots in an Austen-esque vibe? Yes. Yes, it's a fun film. There were cringy moments where if I were Anne, I would want the earth to swallow me whole. I think that the fourth wall break actually works really well. I know a lot of people hate it. But when she starts talking to the camera and telling you what's going on in her thoughts, I had a great time. I loved it. This is the most fun adaptation of Persuasion. So for me, my ranking would be, it depends. If you want it based on how accurately portrayed the film is from the book, then it would be 1995, 2007, and 2022. If we're going off of enjoyment alone, pure enjoyment, 2022, 1995, 2007. But I appreciate that I am very much the outlier on this because I think a lot of people would prefer a more accurate representation of the novel, which makes sense. So do with that what you will. But yeah, another solid reading experience, reading my favourite author, reading her last full novel, and now we will move on to her epistolary novella and her short stories, and then we are done here. Hey vlog, checking in because I have now read Lady Susan, which is the first of the 3 books that we will find here in the bind up of all of the remaining Jane Austen works I have left. The first one, as I said, is Lady Susan, which is a novella that is told entirely in epistolary form. This is a story that was written mostly for her own amusement. There is no indication that she had ever intended to publish it. It's probably one of the first things that she wrote. And in this story, we are following Lady Susan, who is a widow who has a daughter, and she is trying to marry off her daughter so that she can secure her own position so she doesn't have to remarry. And there's a wealthy man who is not the brightest man in the world. She's trying to marry her daughter off to him basically so she can have full control over his wealth because he is not very bright, as she would be able to impart her influence on him. So a very interesting story. I do really enjoy this one. I think that the wit in here comes across really well. I think that Jane Austen does a fantastic voice of creating different voices of the different characters. As it is told in epistolary form, which means it is told in letters, you do need the different penmanship, the different tones of voice that you would get from these characters, and I think that they are done really, really well. You can definitely tell who you're reading from one letter to another. So wonderful story. I had so much fun with getting sunk into it, and I actually have also watched the adaptation, which I think was a very good adaptation for retelling a story that is told entirely in letters. To make a whole film out of it was actually really good. We have Kate Beckinsale coming back in her Jane Austen redemption arc after I criticized her rendition of Emma. She does a wonderful version of Lady Susan. This is a great film adaptation. It expands on it in the places that it needs it, the gaps that would be filled in between the letters, but oh my goodness, it is a wonderful adaptation. I think the characters were all done really well. We have Lady Susan, who in pretty much any other Austen novel would probably be the villain, and not in the way that Emma is, where she has good intentions. This woman has no good intentions apart from her own gain, and I flipping love that Jane Austen wrote this for her. This scheming woman who is just trying to use her daughter as a pawn to improve her own lot. Fantastic. I would highly recommend checking out the film, even if you are not fussed about reading the books, because they are just, it's a fun adaptation. The romances, the way you see her manipulating, just wonderful. The friendships that she has, the relationship she has with her daughter, who is played by the actress that plays Galadriel in Rings of Power, also very, very well done. And yeah, I would recommend checking it out if you haven't. As a Jane Austen retelling goes, as an adaptation, fantastic adaptation. A great visual representation of a really fun, quick story. As you can see, I have 2 more left in here. I have the Watsons and I have Sanditon left to go. So hopefully I will be able to get to those very soon and give you my final thoughts on the last couple of works. Hey vlog, I thought I'd check in again because I have now read The Watsons, which is one of the ones that doesn't have an adaptation. I think that it has a stage play adaptation that then attempts to continue the story and complete it. A lot of it is based a lot more on what Jane Austen's sister Cassandra said that Jane's intentions for the book were, because there's so little of the actual novel. It is said that this got stopped because of the passing of their father, because it is something that would have appeared in the book and it felt too, I think, poignant at the time, so she stopped writing it and then kind of never came back to it. This one is the story of a young woman named Emma, who is the youngest of 6 siblings. She has been living with her aunt, who has been giving her a much better education than the rest of her siblings have been getting. However, when her aunt remarries, her husband then declares that he doesn't want Emma around anymore and sends Emma back home. And when Emma is back home, she is then seeing the way that her siblings are going about desperately trying to get married because they are poorer. Some of them going about it in the right way, some of them going about it in the wrong way, very Bennett coded in that sense. She does have brothers, so that is still something that is less of a concern than the Bennets were facing. Eventually there is a point in which the the siblings lose their father, and then they are somewhat forced into this position of needing more desperately to get married. They are now going to be reliant on their brothers instead, and it is how she has to go and live with her brother and her sister-in-law she dislikes, which feels a little bit more sensibility. So I don't know how foundational this was for then her to have taken like the Bennet storyline and then also the Dashwood storyline and kind of like split it in two. I don't know, because it's got a lot of overlap there. You don't get a huge amount more from the story. The father is a character that I found quite interesting, and therefore I don't know if it was based on her own father and that's why she chose to stop writing it. But overall, it was a well-written excerpt of a story. Obviously, I can't really talk too much on it because there's not that much to say. Apart from, as I said, I can see the overlaps there in terms of the characterizations of the family dynamics. The protagonist is called Emma, but she is nothing like Emma Woodhouse. She reminds me more, there's a little bit of Fanny Price's pragmatism in there, and then also Catherine Morland a little bit, in the sense that she is someone who comes from a poorer family, a large family, has been living away, has then experienced more world than the rest of her family. So there's a lot of things going on in here that you then see in her other works. This was originally written in 1803, so before the publication of any of the other books, but she had created the foundations of several of these other books beforehand. So I don't know if also she kind of just decided that in developing Pride and Prejudice and Sensibility and a lot of the overlap, she didn't feel like she had much more new to add to this. But I think it would have been a very interesting conversation in terms of how you survived the loss of your father. And because it was a patriarchal society, the way that your father controls your life being different to the way your brother controls your life. Obviously, a lot of the time we normally see it where either the father is still alive or the father is not alive and there is no brother, or there isn't a very helpful or useful brother like John Dashwood. We don't normally see a huge amount of the person that has raised our protagonist and therefore has had a say on our protagonist's life for her whole life, then passing away, and someone who is equally close to her suddenly having control of her life and being the person in charge of her life, and the way that that can possibly change. So even though you love your brother, them being in charge of your life is different to your father being in charge of your life. So I think some interesting conversations could have come from it. Now, the central romance in here is basically choosing between marrying for love versus marrying for money, and actually needing to make the choice more for the latter. And obviously a lot of Jane Austen's works end up where the two become one, where you have both the story of someone needing to choose between wealth and love, but normally by the end of it they conveniently fall in love with someone who has wealth or a certain measure of protection. Even Edward Ferrars at the end of the day still has a measure of protection and working for Colonel Brandon and having his parish. So it's not like Eleanor suddenly becomes completely destitute. She's got more money than she had when she was living with her mother at Barton Park. So there are a lot of things still going on here that I think could have been a different conversation, I think, from Jane Austen. So it's a shame that we didn't get it, and I would have loved to have seen more from it. I think it's a equally well written story as you would expect from her. Obviously it's unedited, so, and you can tell, but not in a way that it's like because the prose is bad, just that there are bits that maybe she kind of added in later. I'm curious to see what people who are used to reading only really refined and polished Jane Austen works would think of this, because again it's clear that it was never intended to be edited. We're just presented with some extra bits of Jane Austen writing for those of us who could read her for days. So there we have it. Those are my thoughts on the Watsons, and then we are down to the last one. We literally only have Sanditon. Sanditon does have an adaptation, so I will be watching the adaptation and obviously reading the tiny bit of novel that she did manage to write in her lifetime. Hey vlog, checking in for the final time with Sanditon, the last Jane Austen work that I have, the book that she did not manage to complete before she passed away. I also have watched an adaptation, so there's not a huge amount to go on from Sanditon in terms of what we have of the story, but there are some very interesting things brought into play. The first thing that I would like to point out is the thing that everyone points out, is the emphasis on the town. This one I think is somewhat similar to Emma where Emma, there's a lot of focus on the people in the town. It's not just one family or one person or disparate lives of different family members. It is very much this sense of community. But this one has even more emphasis on that. And the setting is much more vivid, and the importance of the place and the location and how passionate everyone is about this place being the central focus, meaning that it's almost like a character in its own right, which is very fascinating and is a new step for Jane Austen, who hadn't really been writing a huge amount about setting really in the larger scheme of things until this point. So that's a fascinating one that I really did enjoy. The second thing that I think it's a shame this book wasn't written, and I would have loved to have read, is that one of our characters, one of our more prominent characters, is Georgiana Lamb, who is from Antigua. Now, granted, from Antigua in the sense of she's probably an heiress, which means that she is probably meant to be white, although no descriptor that I can remember necessarily highlighted that she was definitely white, but she's probably white. She's probably an heiress. It would be very unusual for someone of colour to have this level of prominence. That being said, the fact that we've bothered to bring in someone who is an heiress from Antigua, and knowing Jane Austen's history with abolitionism, means that she clearly was wanting to talk once again about the horrors of the slave trade and another addition to her abolitionist stories. So it's such a shame that this one didn't get written. Those were the two things that stood out the most to me. Then obviously we have our protagonist, Charlotte Haywood, who is a very fascinating character in very Austen-esque fashion. She's very willful, she's very strong, she's got a lot going for her. And even though she doesn't have much money, which again, something we come to expect a lot from Jane Austen characters, she has enough spunk about her that she'll be able to weather being in this town surrounded by these people. I feel like the development that we would have gotten from Sydney would have been interesting as well. And I am sad that this book didn't come to fruition, more so than the Watsons. The Watsons, I don't think that Jane Austen had ever intended to finish. Had she lived to 100, I don't think we'd have gotten that book. It was never meant to be. I don't think, from the way that she didn't run out of time to write it, she chose not to write it. This one, she ran out of time. And this one felt very purposeful, and you can tell which of Jane Austen's books are purposeful. They are satire, they are commentary, and you can tell that that's what this was going to be. So this one is such a shame that we didn't get this book, because I think it would have ended up being a remarkable story. Fascinating things going on in here, and I am so sad that we were deprived of it. As for the adaptation, now this is another one of those that obviously it's difficult for this adaptation to feel accurate because it's not possible, because the book is not finished. That being said, having read a considerable amount of Jane Austen and having watched even more, it is not a faithful adaptation in terms of tone, in terms of some of the story beats and the arcs. It took the concept of Jane Austen's novel and made its own thing. So as an adaptation, it is not faithful. It is not a good adaptation in that regard. Now, is it an entertaining series? I think so. I don't think that it's the best. I don't absolutely love it. I don't feel like I need to get everyone to go watch it. It's not like, oh my God, yes, please go watch it. My biggest takeaway from this whole video, if you want an adaptation, go watch the 2009 BBC adaptation of Emma. That is my best recommendation for any Jane Austen adaptation. This is definitely not going to rank amongst the top 10 even. It was good. It was fun. It was entertaining. As a Regency style show, I really appreciate that we had queer representation. We have several actors of colour, and we're trying to keep it within the realm of reason. We're trying to keep it where we are discussing abolitionism and we are not erasing the existence of the slave trade. We haven't Bridgertoned it where we're colourblind casting. The actress is deliberately black and it is purposeful. She is playing Georgiana Lamb, who is the character who is an Antiguan heiress, and she is mixed race in this show, meaning that her mother is black, her father is white. Her mother was her father's slave, but he decided to keep his daughter. So she is an heiress, but she is of colour. And we do see the repercussions and ramifications of that. So it's not trying to hide her colour. It's not colourblind casting. It is actually featured in the story, which was an interesting choice. Again, we also have the idea that if you are queer, you would probably have been executed during this time period. So we do have the cautions would have needed to have taken and or safeguarding that they would have needed to put in place to be able to live as their authentic selves. So that is depicted in the story. It's not pretending that Regency England was this utopia, especially when we're discussing things like women's rights or when we're discussing things like classism that are still prevalent from the novel. You can't then go hide all of the other problems like homophobia and racism. So I think that that was handled really well on the show's part. I do think that obviously it's supposed to be a happy show, so there is a limit to how much we go into those things, but the fact they're addressed and talked about I thought was a decent shot, and I think that Jane Austen would have been very proud of that discussion and conversation, given what I've seen from her storytelling and accounts from her letters and stuff about where her politics align. So that's good. I appreciate that. Now, some of the romances felt a bit contrived. Some of the story felt very, very out of step with anything you would get from Jane Austen. We had a pseudo incest section going on there, which was not great. We've got a couple who are the people that Charlotte stays with, that every season he needs to do something incredibly stupid, and his wife constantly has to set him on the straight and narrow, and at the end of every season he is talking about how he'll never underestimate or not appreciate his wife again, and then the next season he's doing the exact same thing, which felt repetitive. I did like that we had multiple love interests and the way that that was handled. I think that was very Jane Austen-esque. I did appreciate that. So there was some storylines that I think were handled really well and some that I think were handled very not Jane Austen-y. They're not necessarily bad storylines, they just don't align with what you'd expect from a Jane Austen adaptation. So then it's entirely down to you as to whether or not you are picking this up because it's Regency and it's fun, or are you picking this up because it's a Jane Austen adaptation, because you will get very different experiences depending on what you are choosing to pick up this adaptation for. I went in initially with the hope of getting a Jane Austen adaptation and ended up very much having to resign myself to, no, this isn't very Austen-esque. There are some elements that are very Austen-esque. It felt like fan fiction, something that a contemporary author who is a fan of Jane Austen would do with the story. And I appreciate that. You could see the threads of Austenness that were in there, but it is not a very good adaptation if you are specifically wanting the Jane Austen touch into a adaptation. So do with that what you will. I think that it was well acted. I think it was well cast. It was engaging and entertaining. There were some episodes that I found a bit frustrating. Like I said, where some characters feel like they had taken 3 steps back from the progress that they had made in previous episodes or seasons. There were other characters that had a really smooth sailing, constant progression, which I did really enjoy. There were some things that I liked, some things that I didn't, some things that I think were well handled but weren't very Jane Austen-y, some things that I think were very clear influences by Jane Austen. My biggest gripe with the Jane Austen influence actually is that in the last season we kept getting Jane Austen quotes. So it's things like "I love you most ardently." There were several like Austen quotes from other novels that weren't even from the Sanditon novel, they're from other novels, to try and remind the viewer that it's Austen-esque. And it's like, actually, you don't need to be reminded. It's better if I forget you're trying to do Jane Austen than if you remind me you're trying to do Jane Austen, because then I'm going to compare you to Jane Austen and you will inherently fall short. So it was an odd time. It's not one that I would go out of my way to say, yes, definitely go watch it. If you are wanting a Jane Austen adaptation, definitely not. If you want some Regency fun that is loosely based on a Jane Austen novel that never got finished and it's got therefore some like linking threads to it, but you just kind of want Regency vibes, go for it. The same way I would recommend Bridgerton to Jane Austen fans. It's just like, it's the time period and it's a romance-ish and it's entertaining. Quality-wise, it's not there. It's just not, in my opinion. So do with that what you will, and hopefully you'll have found a decent recommendation from this video. But that is all for this vlog. It has been going on far too long. So let me know, 1, what your favourite Jane Austen book is, 2, what your favourite Jane Austen character is, and 3, what your favourite Jane Austen adaptation is. While you're at it, you can also let me know who's your favourite Jane Austen romantic lead, if that's something that you are into. But yeah, that is all from me for today. So thank you ever so much for watching, and I will hopefully catch you in another one soon.